So I'll tell you a little bit about what it is that here I'm playing, and also some of the different sort of things that I'll be doing with it. First off, this is a Holloway harp guitar model. This is one that's based off of the Americanized version of it from around the turn of last century. It was something that was brought into the United States by the Larson brothers, who were based out of the upper Midwest. They were very creative luthiers or guitar builders. And what they did is around that period of time, steel string guitars were really making a little bit more of inroads into the United States. And they had taken an older idea, which was in Europe, was what's called the contra guitar. Is basically like a classical guitar with extra sub-bass strings that aren't fretted. So you can see like a standard guitar has frets that you can change the pitch on. These lower strings, these what we call sub-bass strings, they just resonate, they just ring. And there's about 3 different ways to really kind of use them. One of the things that we'll see here today is I'm going to be changing the tuning a lot. There are a couple of standardized ideas for tuning, but one of the catches to this instrument is that, like the players and the way that you would use it, it's very individualistic. So you can see that this is a very standard sort of model, but yet the way that you adjust it and change it around is really mostly left up to the player. We'll see that there's 3 different ways that I'm going to use here today in this program. The first thing that we'll see is a little bit of kind of a more hybrid attack. And one of the things that we can see is a lot of players nowadays, they use the strings, the lower strings, a little bit differently than it was originally done, where they would use the lower strings to really support the typical sort of guitar chords or sounds. And one of the other things that you'll see that I'll do today is also what we call sympathetic strings, which is where the strings will resonate, may not be using them or plucking them as much. So we'll see again a couple of different ways here. There's a few harp guitarists who have made inroads into this instrument that are very popular. One of them, who's a modern guitarist, he plays mostly in Europe, but he's going to be doing some US touring, is Andy McKee, and I'll be pulling out a couple of his pieces, as well as some original pieces and some other artists. This next piece is going to use some of that, and this is one of those things that I see from studying even some of the older classical guitar masters. When you look at some of the Giuliani or Aguado pieces, that you'll run into some of these studies that also kind of overlap into this instrument, and probably were also played in a similar fashion on the earlier cousin to this. So again, one of the other common ways to play this is that I'm going to use the lower tones to basically support what's going on with the standard sort of guitar side. And this is, again, a very common sort of use with this. The contra guitar was played in a lot of music halls and taverns starting off in Austria in around the 1700s. And it would typically be used in like a quartet or a quintet with some other instruments such as the accordion or concertina, maybe a horn, maybe a violin or a mandolin. And so this was probably one of the major functions of it, was to cover both of those sort of aspects of it. Again, there's not very many harp guitarists that are really active. In the United States, there's probably around 24. And fortunately, because of the advent of this instrument, for example, as the Holloway harp guitarists, which are based out of Idaho, then the number has started to increase. The gentleman who's running it, Scott Burrell, has really done a very good job. He's not only a fantastic player, but he's also been a very good crafter. This is one of their earlier ones that they had put out from 2008. It's actually one of their prototypes, and they've since then refined them a little bit more. And again, it's a little different kind of instrument. Your standard guitar, where you might have those 6 strings, and they're typically tuned to a very set sort of tuning. And what you'll see here in a little bit later into the program is I'll start changing around the tuning of not just the low strings, but also the upper strings as well, which presents a lot of little difficulties, as there's a big catch of these instruments in that they really have a lot more tension on them than the standard sort of guitar. The standard guitar on its tension going from the bridge section to the nut is usually no more than around 188 foot-pounds. On this instrument, it can reach up to about 350 foot-pounds just because of the extra sub-bass, and then of course depending as to what the player tunes it to. the last selection out of this first sort of way to kind of play in a more standardized tuning. I'm going to finish off with a little bit of another Andy McKee song, and then I'm going to start switching into some of what you can hear as some more progressive sort of ways to play, and also in that other way I was talking about where the strings are a little bit more sympathetic. Again, Andy McKee is a fantastic guitarist, and like a lot of people who segue into the harp guitar, they tend to also be very good guitarists as well as, you know, incorporating other elements. I know that one of the things that always attracted me to this instrument was not only to be a little different as far as the acoustic side, but I also played bass for a long time too, and trying to incorporate the two is very difficult. So again, one of the things that's very difficult is there's not a whole lot of material that's really written for this instrument. There's a couple of artists who've been really good in putting out some of their material. But overall, one of the things that I constantly find is that if you're really going to try to play this instrument, one of the things that you end up doing is really creating your own music for it. And in that kind of regard, it really involves, again, smashing a lot of things together. And one of the things that's very interesting is that it was very common on the guitar in its earlier years to really put it into what they call an open tuning, which means that rather than having to put a lot of fingers onto the strings in order to make chords, now all of a sudden you could use those open strings to really get a chord to happen. And some of the earlier sort of guitars, you can hear that they did this. As a matter of fact, there's some really great roundabout sort of ways that this happened. The Spanish guitar, which is really where the guitar originally comes from, they would typically tune, sometimes in the gypsy styles, to what we commonly refer to as an open G or a Spanish tuning. When that guitar had made it over to Hawaii, then the Hawaiians took that instrument and then they adapted very, very many tunings. So Hawaiian tunings are very similar to sometimes what you can find with American clawhammer banjo tunings, in that there's really about hundreds of those things, as much as the player can create. And in American music, we can find that as those things really found their way back over to America, and even as they came up through the Spanish guitar, up through Mexico, through the rancheros, that also adapted and changed its way. And you can commonly hear it being used in a lot of older blues and country music. It's one of the bases for it, is to use those open tunings. Rather than using a more standardized sort of open tuning though, here I'm going to change it up so that it's a very different sort of way of doing that. And I'm going to take one of these songs and also segue it and do a little medley into another song by a gentleman by the name of Michael Hedges. Michael Hedges was a guitarist and harp guitarist based out of, or came around in the 1980s. And he was a very important figure in acoustic guitar, in the sense that he really modernized the way that a lot of players looked at it as far as amplifying it up so that it can be heard. Because on its own, this instrument is very quiet. I mean, I can play it, and as lightly as I'm playing it, you're probably not going to hear it very far, even though this is a library. So I'm going to do one of the pieces that he had that was called the Double Planet, and I'm going to start off with one of my pieces here. And again, it's Michael Hedges. It's the second of those two pieces. Is a piece that he wrote called Double Planet. And the first piece that you heard there was a piece that I wrote. It's called Fireflies. I wrote it while at a wedding that my younger son, we were out catching fireflies with a bunch of the other kids that were there. And it was pretty fun because they're a very easy game to catch at any age. They're pretty slow moving. And we didn't have anything to put it in, so we just kept putting it in his pocket. And of course he said, I got fireflies in my pocket all blinking around, which is good, as long as you don't pat them too hard. This is another piece that I wrote. This is called Leaves, and I wrote this a couple of autumns ago while sitting in the music room that I have in my house and looking at the leaves falling and thinking it'd be really great to go out there and rake them, but it'd probably be even better to just sit and write a song about it. Seemed like a good plan.
Leaves appreciate it.
Yeah, they did. They got me yesterday. My back is killing me. My son's not old enough yet. He's a good supervisor. Thank you. So for some of the last segment here that I'll do today is what I really feel is the third way to really kind of play this instrument. And I'm going to pull out another medley of songs